So the Las Vegas Raiders are going to have a very, very important decision to make when it comes to their head coach, when it comes to their quarterback, as well as when it comes to the NFL draft and kind of the approach they want to take as they go forward. And I want to take a second here just to kind of talk about the future of the Raiders and really talk about the direction that this team really has to consider as they go forward. I saw this tweet earlier where they're essentially talking about if the Raiders could potentially be one of the teams that takes Daniel Jones, who was most recently benched with the New York Giants. He's a guy that has had upside, he has had success, but he hasn't been able to kind of simulate that same success he had early on in his career. And he's basically a guy that the Giants are ready to move off of. And in this tweet, they're talking about how the Raiders could be a good fit for Daniel Jones because of the fact that they do have weapons on offense. They do have an offensive line that's young and that could really develop going into next year into something a lot better than what it was, maybe this year and even the year before. And then more than that, they have guys like Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers. They can still add some talent. Maybe you go out and get a wide receiver like T. Higgins. Maybe you go out and trade for a guy like Amari Cooper. And then on top of that, they have a really, really, really good defensive line and generally speaking, a good defense. Right? Given that the Raiders defense is healthy, they have a solid unit on that side. And this article is making the point that the Raiders should go out and get Daniel Jones. And I'm not saying that I'm 100% for that or 100% against that. Truth be told, I trust Tom Telesco and I trust the direction he's going to get the Raiders on. But I think it's very, very important that we recognize something within this next quarterback class. Last year we had 6 quarterbacks go before the Raiders picked at the 13th overall pick. And those 6 quarterbacks that went before the Raiders ultimately made their pick was kind of surprising, right? But there was also a reason why we had so many quarterbacks last year go as high as they ultimately went. Teams recognize that this year's class is not as good. In fact, there's no quarterback in this class coming into the actual class that teams are like, that's a number 1 overall pick worthy of quarterback. Coming into this season, it was Carson Beck of Georgia that most people said is the number 1 quarterback. And out of nowhere comes this guy in Cam Ward. And Cam Ward has surprisingly looked really, really good. And he's now the number 1 quarterback, according to most NFL scouts. But we knew last year coming into this class that this class would not be as good, right? Or at least it's kind of proven that it's really not that good. And we have a lot of guys that are juniors that'll go back to school. And now the Raiders are going to be in a tough situation. If you have the number 1 overall pick, you can go forward and you can get that quarterback. But if you don't, then you got to make a decision on what you want to do. See, if you're the Raiders and you have, let's say, the 5th overall pick, you have to make that decision at that point. You have the 5th overall pick. You can either take a quarterback, which is going to be likely the 2nd or 3rd quarterback at that point. If you don't want to take a quarterback at that point because you feel like Shedeur Sanders or Jalen Milroe are not worthy of a 4th or 5th overall pick, you have to make a decision. Maybe you take Travis Hunter, maybe you take Ashton Genty, and you add to your offense and you get a lot better on the offense side of the football. Maybe you add a cornerback like Will Johnson, who some people think is the next best corner in the NFL. Maybe you go down that route, but then that also means what are you going to do at the quarterback position? You can roll forward with Gardner Minshew, but chances are you're not going to have a whole lot of success with Minshew. Right? Gardner Minshew is a very, very limited quarterback. To me, even if you had a great offensive coordinator, he's still going to be limited at the end of the day. A great offensive coordinator might be able to win 7, 8, 9 games with Minshew, but it's just not good enough. Now, alternatively, you can go out and say, hey, maybe Mac Jones takes the next step. Justin Fields takes the next step. Zach Wilson takes the next step. And maybe you go forward and say, we'll bring in one of these guys and we'll roll forward with that. Maybe you say Daniel Jones and Sam Darnold have shown tremendous upside. Let's bring in one of those quarterbacks. Maybe the Raiders go down this approach where they say, let's go out and get a veteran quarterback paired up with a guy like Travis Hunter, or Will Johnson, or Ashton Genty. And you go forward into next season with the same coaching staff. Maybe you bring in a different offensive coordinator. And you say, let's win football games going down this path. Let's just get better as a football team. It's going to be an interesting decision what the Raiders ultimately end up making because right now, everybody wants the Raiders to just take a quarterback. 3rd, 4th, 5th overall pick, take Shedeur Sanders, take Cam Ward, take Garrett Nussmeier, whoever it ends up being, right? Take that quarterback and don't think twice. But the thing is would it make more sense to get better as a team or does it make more sense to try to find a quarterback, even if the quarterback may not ultimately be worth that pick? Right? I think it's something the Raiders have to realistically consider. The best thing the Raiders could do is draft Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward, and he ends up being a franchise quarterback. But the worst thing we can do is draft one of those guys knowing that there's probably not a lot of upside, and maybe those guys aren't really NFL ready, and they bust out, and then you miss out, 3-4 years down the line, looking back at it, on the next Adrian Peterson caliber running back, or maybe it's a franchise tackle, or maybe it's a different position, and you miss out on those guys. One of the things that the Pittsburgh Steelers have done a really good job at is they've ultimately decided that, hey, we don't want to go 100% on just trying to get that rookie quarterback and give up multiple assets. Instead, we want to just build a competent roster, and we want to go out and try to bring in a veteran quarterback that could ultimately have success. When most people wrote off Russell Wilson, most people wrote off Justin Fields, the Pittsburgh Steelers said, we'll take both of those guys super cheap. We'll take both of those guys, and we'll win 7, 8, 9 games, and we'll be one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the NFL. Because we decide that our strategy is going to be ultimately to not draft or overdraft the quarterback. Instead, just build out the roster. The Pittsburgh Steelers right now have essentially 3 rookie offensive linemen that are starters for them. Their center, right guard, right tackle are all rookies. Although I think their right tackle might have actually went down, so they now have their second-year tackle, Barter Jones, starting for them. But to me, the Pittsburgh Steelers aren't great on the offensive line. Like, you look at the Raiders and you compare the Raiders offense to the Pittsburgh Steelers offense, there's not a whole lot of difference. It's not like the Pittsburgh Steelers just have burners across the offense. The Pittsburgh Steelers win by playing conservative on the offense. They're able to score points when it's needed. Russell Wilson is obviously managing everything and kind of getting it done. But it's the defense that's doing a really good job. And really, the defense is led by, obviously TJ Watt's a great football player, but it's really led by like that scheme. They obviously have Minkah Fitzpatrick as well, who's a really good football player in the secondary. But to me, I don't think the Las Vegas Raiders are so far away from a Pittsburgh Steelers caliber of defense. To me, the Raiders, all they have to do is really just get healthy, 100% healthy, and then add one guy in the secondary. And maybe that's Will Johnson, right? Maybe Will Johnson puts the Raiders over the top and they become a top-tier defense. We never got to see this actual defense come together because of the fact that Malcolm Koonce ended up, he missed pretty much from the time we're coming into the season. I think it was the last week before the season even started. The guy was out, right? And it's unfortunate that he ended up getting out because Malcolm Koonce, some people were saying, could have the same type of production that Maxx Crosby had. In fact, he had matched Maxx Crosby last year in the second half of the season. So if we had that guy with Maxx Crosby and Christian Wilkins, when Christian Wilkins and Maxx Crosby were on the field together, our defense was still good. Those 2 guys are still dominating and making plays. But we could have had arguably one of the top 2 or 3 defensive lines had we actually been healthy. And what's crazy to me is that the Raiders could theoretically bring that unit back next year, and they could even add a guy that's a difference maker on the back. And maybe it's Travis Hunter that you add, right? Maybe it's a playmaker like that, or maybe it's Will Johnson, or maybe you go out and say, hey, we think Mason Graham's going to be an absolute superstar. We think he'll be the best defensive lineman in the NFL. Maybe you add him, right? And you make your defense even better. But at the same time, the alternative is now you have to decide on the quarterback situation. Sam Darnold is a free agent next year, right? And the Minnesota Vikings are likely not bringing him back. In fact, Sam Darnold, based off his play this year, is likely to get like a 2 or 3 year contract worth north of $20-25 million. And for the Raiders, you could consider that, right? You can consider bringing in Sam Darnold. Now, I think the one wild card in all of this will come down to the fact that, is Antonio Pierce your actual head coach going into next season? Because we always got to remember, if Antonio Pierce is your head coach, that means your offensive coordinator is either going to be Scott Turner or it's going to be someone else that Antonio Pierce ultimately hires. And we don't really know who that's going to be. Right? Maybe a guy like Clay Kubiak ends up getting fired with the Saints because they had their coaching staff kind of change out. Then maybe you hire him as your offensive coordinator. And if it's not that, right, there's other coaches that are currently head coaches in the NFL that might ultimately end up getting fired as we kind of go forward. Right? There's multiple guys after that you may be able to target. So maybe the Raiders go down that path. But regardless of that, we don't really know if those guys are guys that could develop quarterbacks. So if you draft the quarterback and Antonio Pierce is still here, are we sure Antonio Pierce can be able to develop that quarterback? Right? Because a lot of what we've seen happen is quarterbacks will come into the NFL. They're not ready. They're not ready to be starting caliber guys. They'll kind of get thrown in there and then they'll get pulled. Ultimately, the team kind of gives up on them. We've seen Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold kind of have success. Years later, I think Sam Darnold's in like year 7 this year, and he kind of took off this year. Baker Mayfield last year kind of took off, right? So there's a whole lot of directions that the Raiders could go, but I think it's really going to come down to Antonio Pierce. And something tells me Mark Davis is not ready to fire Antonio Pierce. I think one of the things the Raiders want to do as a team is they want to get to a point where they're consistent with their coaching staff, they're consistent with the roster and with the team, and they're not having so much turnover. And I think one of the big parts of not essentially having that is you got to make sure the guy at the top is consistent, right? Tom Telesco and Antonio Pierce are not paired together, right? We're not going to fire both. We can fire one or the other. And of course, Tom Telesco just got here, so chances are he'll be here for the next 5 years. Which also means that if Antonio Pierce is not able to get it done, not even this year, but like even if you decided to keep him, he can't get it done next year. You can move off of Antonio Pierce, and then you can hire another head coach at that point, 2 years down the line. Plus, Tom Telesco will still be here, so if Tom Telesco can potentially add some players, if he can add some talent, maybe the Raiders are able to actually have success down the line because they've actually built a solid team. It's interesting because I think the best teams in the NFL right now either have a great head coach or they have a great organization that drafts really, really well. You look at teams like the Chiefs, right? The Chiefs obviously have a great head coach, a great quarterback, but they also have a great talent evaluator with their general manager. They do a great job bringing guys in, developing them, and just making them solid football players. And the Raiders don't really have all of that yet, right? We don't really have a head coach that we're sold on. We don't really have a quarterback we're sold on. But we might have a general manager that could actually have success, right? Brock Bowers, phenomenal pick. Jackson Powers-Johnson, superstar caliber center, right? The first two picks that Tom Telesco has drafted, you can already watch the tape and tell those guys are going to be top tier caliber players. Both guys, right, are going to be top 5 players. If not, both guys are going to be top 2 or 3 players at their positions. And to me, if we allowed Tom Telesco to just kind of draft for a couple of years, maybe we would have had Christian Darrisaw instead of Alex Leatherwood. Maybe we would have had, CeeDee Lamb, which, that was the wide receiver one for whatever reason. The Raiders decided not to draft him. Maybe even beyond that, we'd have Jalen Carter as opposed to Tyree Wilson. Right, so there's a lot the Raiders could have potentially had. And I think the best thing the Raiders could do right now is not to overshoot the quarterback position. Because from what I'm hearing right now, Shedeur Sanders is not guaranteed to be a first-round pick. Now, he might go in the first round because of the fact that quarterbacks just kind of get overvalued a little bit. But right now, the quarterback class does not look good. And I think there's a real reason why so many quarterbacks went last year. Some people think if Bo Nix or J.J. McCarthy were in this class, or even Michael Penix, they'd be the number 1 quarterback in the class. Right? That is what teams are kind of saying right now. So we'll see what ends up happening. I just wanted to kind of make this video to just talk about what could happen ultimately. I know everybody wants a quarterback, but I think we should honestly consider not taking a quarterback in this class and really think about the future and kind of how we want to build as a team. I think one of the things the Raiders have done a lot over the past couple of years is they've skipped steps, and ultimately it's just gotten them back to the same point where it just doesn't work. Right? If you really want to have success long term, you got to make sure you have a good offensive line, a good defensive line, a good coach, good coordinators, a good system, good drafting, right? You can't skip steps. And I feel like with the Raiders, instead of skipping steps, let's just do the right thing and just, really build up that talent pool by drafting well, right? And not reaching, not taking guys that don't make sense at certain points. Let me know what you guys think, man. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with another video.